and Len Bias. Dave Ungrady is the author of 3 other books, besides Born Ready, which is the mixed legacy of Len Bias, which will be available back after we're finished for sale. And you can get it signed, I assume. Dave Ungrady is the author of 3 other books: Unlucky, A Season of Struggle in the Minor Leagues Professional Soccer; the best-selling Tales from the Maryland Terrapins, a collection of the greatest stories ever told; and Legends of Maryland Basketball. Dave is a contributing writer to the New York Times. His work has also appeared in the Washington Post and Sport magazine, and on NBC, CNN, ESPN, and Voice of America. Okay, David, thank you.
Thank you, John. It truly is an honor to be in this environment, the home of an accomplished journalist. I have a journalism background, graduated from the University of Maryland, got a journalism degree, and this book is a work of journalism, if anything. It was a very, very hard book to write. How many people remember Len Bias and his story? I was an athlete, quick background, I was an athlete at Maryland before Len was there, competed in track and field on scholarship, and also played soccer for a year. I knew a lot of people in the athletic department who were impacted greatly by Len's death. I saw how it affected them personally. I saw what it did to the department. It's a big reason I wanted to do this book. I saw Len play, covered him as a journalist a little bit, and really lived that time when Len died and saw the impact. So that's why I wanted to do a book on his legacy, not about how he died. Most of us know how he died. The book is called Born Ready, The Mixed Legacy of Len Bias, because it does have a mixed legacy. His death impacted a lot of lives in a negative way. It also helped save lives. Anecdotally, a lot of people told me that they never used drugs because of Len's death, how he died from cocaine use. It was a big red light or stop sign that said, hey, if he's going to die using it, I better stay away. So there are some, you hate to think something like that's going to lead to positive things, but it helped people stay away from drugs. Born Ready, I called it Born Ready because Len had an interaction with his coach at Maryland, Lefty Driesell. Before games, Coach Driesell would look for Len and ask Len, how you feeling? And every time Coach said he asked him, Len would say, Coach, I'm born ready, which meant he was born ready to have another great game, born ready to do great in basketball. The irony of his life and his legacy is he was not born ready for other things in his life, had to deal with pressures, which impacted his last year especially, and maybe why he was using drugs more than people would have liked. So that's the reason the book is titled as it is. I'm going to read you a few passages that I hope capture the variety of his legacy, good, bad, and compelling. This is in the front section of the book. The death of Bias dealt such a serious blow to his sport that he has become an iconic figure for a generation. More than any athlete who has died in the last half century, Bias still evokes a searing and confusing mix of regret and remorse, anger and sympathy, bewilderment and bitterness, and lingering sadness over the success the young athlete might have known had he not celebrated too hard too soon. If you remember, he died 2 days after the Celtics made him the number 2 pick in the 1986 draft, and he was partying to celebrate that. Had Bias not died of cocaine intoxication on June 19, 1986, he would likely have formed a fierce front court for the Celtics for more than a decade, one that arguably might have been unmatched in NBA history. Had he lived, Bias would be approaching the age of 50. He would have turned 50 next month. Long retired from what would almost surely have been a brilliant NBA career and perhaps as beloved in Boston as legends Larry Bird and Bob Cousy. How do you define the legacy of a universally endeared and admired All-American basketball player, one with the potential to be one of the greatest of all time, when he goes and throws it all away? How can you honor a young man whose youthful indiscretion placed the University of Maryland into a tailspin that lasted for almost a decade? How can a fan or even a friend of Len Bias salute the achievements and joy of his brief life without acknowledging how his choice that night wreaked havoc on the world around him, both near and far. You want to badly, but even 27 years later, you struggle. Take a leisurely walk through the Comcast Center in College Park, Maryland, the epicenter of the University of Maryland athletics and home venue of the men's and women's basketball teams, and you will pass a temple of Terrapin's tradition and triumph known as the Maryland Walk of Fame. Life-size photo cutouts of the best athletes ever to grace the fields, the pools, the tracks, mats, courts, and courses in College Park spring to life. The first image you see on the left is Ronaldo Nehemiah, if you remember him, a world record holder, while a student at Maryland in 110-meter hurdles. Saunter to the middle and you notice two of Maryland's all-time great basketball players from the 1970s, All-Americans Len Elmore and Tom McMillan, standing side by side. Most of the several dozen athletes or teams displayed on that wall have been selected to the Maryland Athletic Hall of Fame. Bias is on that Hall of Fame, on that Wall of Fame, but he is not in Maryland's Hall of Fame. He is the only two-time ACC Player of the Year and is considered by many to be among the top basketball talents ever to wear a Maryland uniform. None of the others left out of the Hall of Fame matches Bias's athletic impact. Len Bias is not in Maryland's Athletic Hall of Fame because of the way he died. There's a bylaw that says if you brought any embarrassment to the university, you cannot be inducted into the Hall of Fame. It's a very subjective element to that Hall of Fame criteria. Let's go to Len's career. His sophomore year was when he really started to have an impact on the game of basketball in college, when people really started to notice him on a national level. The Terrapins ended the season in 1984 24-8, finishing second in the ACC regular season standings with a 9-5 conference record. Despite his impressive numbers, Len finished the year second on the team in points, 15.2 per game, and third in rebounds, 4.5 per game. He was not selected to the All-ACC team when it was announced in early March. The snub provided added motivation. A friend, Brian Waller, remembers receiving a phone call from Bias. "You see the paper today?" he asked. "I didn't even make the second team. You see the dudes they got in front of me? That's all right. I'm going to go down to the ACC tournament and win the MVP." Maryland made it to the Sweet 16 of the NCAA tournament that year after winning the ACC tournament for the first time since 1958. In the tournament, Bias had 15 points and 7 rebounds in a first-round win over NC State. He had 15 points in a 2-point semifinal win over Wake Forest. In the final game against Duke, as a sophomore, Bias scored 26 points, making 12 of 17 field goals. 10 came on a 24-3 run that erased an 8-point Duke lead. It was enough to convince voters to name him the tournament MVP, just as he had proclaimed. Len Bias, many of us may remember the basketball coach Mike Krzyzewski from Duke University. He's won 4 national titles at Duke. Started coaching in the ACC in 1980. He's coached the USA men's basketball team to 2 Olympic gold medals. Very few people have as an authoritative mind or can speak as authoritatively about basketball talent as Mike Krzyzewski. He said there were 2 players, since he has been coaching in the ACC, that could do things that no one else could do. Michael Jordan and Len Bias. Michael Jordan was a year older than Len Bias. Left his junior year, so they played really only 2 years against each other. But many considered him to be as good, if not better, than Michael Jordan. Let's move now to, we talked about Len's senior year. I made a little bit of reference to that. He was starting to struggle with things in his life. He was an ACC Player of the Year the previous year, and a lot was expected of him personally. The team had a good year after his junior year, and Len was starting to feel some of the pressure. And this is one thing he did. This establishes his legacy, helps establish his legacy. Things seemed to be on the upswing when Maryland beat Clemson to win its second consecutive ACC game. This is midway, it's toward the end of the season. Then traveled to Raleigh, North Carolina to play NC State. Bias scored a team-high 21 points and made 2 free throws, with about a minute and a half left that helped clinch the 1-point win for Maryland. Having now won 3 consecutive ACC games, Maryland was on a bit of a roll. But that momentum fizzled after Drizel suspended Bias and teammates Jeff Baxter and John Johnson for violating a team curfew after the NC State game. Bias was a captain on the team. Media reports said the 3 players returned at about 4 a.m. to Maryland's hotel after watching a replay of the game at a friend's room on the NC State campus. But that's not what happened. Baxter admits that the 3 were actually at an off-campus party with an NC State player whose name he declined to make public. He insists that neither he, Bias, nor Johnson drank alcohol or took drugs. The party included what Johnson calls a freak mama contest, set up to select the most attractive female. This is the 1980s. We are just dancing, and we had a ball, Baxter says with a laugh. We were pumped up that we won the game. I still remember to this day how much fun that was. Drizel benched Bias, Baxter, and Johnson for the next game, a loss to Clemson. They returned the following game, and the team earned a comfortable victory over the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. Len was starting to show that he was a little reckless personally with his life. His cocaine use was starting to increase. Other parts of the book, I talked to sources who say he was using cocaine up to twice a week. Not on a regular basis, but he was using it to that level. I classify that as recreational. Some people say that was a little more than recreational. There were no indications he was addicted to cocaine from all the people I talked to. This certainly establishes Len's legacy no more than any other act in his life. This is the night he died. This is, again, 2 days after he was drafted by the Celtics. He comes back to the University of Maryland campus. He returned to town about 10 o'clock, goes right to campus. Never saw his mother that night. He was hoping to see her, but they never crossed paths. She was expecting to see him the next day. Bias returned to his dormitory suite at Washington Hall after 10:30 p.m. with a bag full of Reebok shoes and Boston Celtics jerseys. Len was about to sign a contract with Reebok that was going to rival the contract Michael Jordan had signed with Nike. Jordan had signed his contract about 4 or 5 months prior to that. Reebok was going to make Bias the marquee personality of all their athletes. He had never signed it yet, though. He had never signed a contract with the Celtics, that they were all in negotiation. Dave, back to the room, the scene. David Gregg, a freshman basketball player, and Maryland football players Keita Covington and Ben Jefferson were there eating crabs. Bias wanted them to have a party. Terry Long, another teammate, testified in a court case a year after Len died. We were going to celebrate, Bias said to Gregg, Covington, and Jefferson. About 20 minutes later, Bias left the suite at about 11:30 p.m. with Madeline Woods, a friend of Bias's who stopped by to visit. Bias said he had to go drain his lizard. We knew what he meant, Long said. He said he hadn't been with a girl in 3 days. Long and Gregg walked to a nearby convenience store to buy soft drinks and went to sleep when they returned. At around 2:30 a.m., Bias knocked on Long's bedroom door and said, "Wake the expletive up. We're going to celebrate." They were living on campus because, interestingly, Len was still in school. He was at least 12 credits short of graduating, 12 and 18 credits. Ironically, he was trying to get his degree, move toward that the summer after he was eligible. Bias woke up Gregg and told Gregg and Long to get some beer from a nearby refrigerator. Long and Gregg saw a mound of cocaine on a mirror on the desk when they returned to Long's room. After Gregg asked Bias and Tribble where the cocaine came from, Long said Tribble said something. Brian Tribble was another person in the room. Tribble said something about getting it from the bottom of his stash, and they planned to get a kilo the next day. Long, Gregg, Bias, and Tribble started snorting the cocaine through cut straws until about 3 a.m. When Jeff Baxter knocked on Long's door, Long told Tribble to put the cocaine away because the players knew Baxter did not use drugs. Baxter stayed for about 15 minutes. The others then resumed snorting cocaine. Tribble went to the bathroom, stumbled back to Long's room, and said, we're all expletive up. Long added that day they all felt much the same way. They snorted cocaine until about 6 a.m. Bias then rested on Long's bed for a few minutes before struggling to go to the bathroom because he was wobbly. He then suffered a seizure. Long placed a pair of scissors in Bias's mouth to prevent him from biting his tongue while Gregg held Bias's feet. picture his teammates, his friends, seeing this iconic figure, an Adonis, on the floor, trembling. Not in the book, but Jeff Baxter told me one of the things that really stuck out in his mind when he saw him there, Len had a necklace around his neck. He said, what am I going to do with that? I mean, your mind does crazy things when you see these things going on. Tribble called his mother, who told him to call the county emergency number for an ambulance. Tribble made the emergency call at 6:32 a.m. After the ambulance took Bias to the hospital, Long cleaned the empty beer bottles and cut straws from his room and emptied them into a dumpster behind the dormitory. Bias was pronounced dead at the hospital at 8:55 a.m. Cocaine intoxication was later determined to be the cause. That day set off a flurry of activity unprecedented at the University of Maryland. Maryland athletics. Federal drug legislation was passed in 1986 directly related to Len's death, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which established mandatory minimums for cocaine possession distribution. 5 grams of crack cocaine puts you in jail for a minimum of 5 years. 500 grams of powder cocaine puts you in jail for a minimum of 5 years. The disparity put a lot of young black men in prison for decades. Recently, Congress came to their senses. In 2011, they passed the Fair Sentencing Act, which reduced the disparity between crack and powder cocaine. And within the last few months, you may remember that the Justice Department has started encouraging states attorneys general to use your judgment and not imposing those harsh penalties. So they're working back now to remedy that problem. This is all part of the vast legacy of Len Bias. It's not just a sports story. It's a social change story. It's a tragic story, and it still has impact today. If you have any questions, I'm here to ask them. Hopefully I didn't go too long. Thank you. Before I take some questions, I would like to mention that from this book, I've started something called the Born Ready Project, which teaches primarily life skills to teenagers and young adults. I speak to them about decision-making and resilience. Len made a very bad decision that night. That's all it was. People blame the university for this and that, not having enough structure for the athletes. Were they checking them on using drugs? Were they hard on them on watching their academic performances strictly enough? That had nothing to do with it. Len made the decision. Unfortunately, it killed him. So I try to use that story to get their attention and teach them how to make good decisions. And that's part of the Born Ready Project. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Yes?
As I recall the story, what happened was that something about he had a heart defect as well.
No heart defect.
That's not true.
Now, that may have stemmed from there were 2 previous Maryland basketball players who died of heart conditions. Within 4 or 5 years, no, this is in the 1970s, I'm sorry. So, and under the same coach, Lefty Grizzell, so there was some overreaction that maybe he had a heart condition. What happened, they say cocaine intoxication, because he consumed a form of cocaine called fish scale. It was 97% pure. So whoever brought it in that room knew where to get cocaine. It's never been officially determined who brought it in the room. Brian Tribble to this day will deny he brought it in, but that seems to be the common theory. But he was consuming so much of it to the extent where his brain shut down his heart. He was consuming so much that I mentioned this other player, David Gregg, who was a freshman on the team, went to Len's high school. He looked up to Len. Len was his idol. He wanted to be like Len Bias. But he was also immersed in some drug problems that year. Len introduced him to cocaine. So David Gregg is telling him, Len, slow down, you're going to hurt yourself. Boom, a little while later. And Len had the attitude, which made him a great basketball player. We're talking about being born ready as a great basketball player, but not for other things in his life. His attitude was, I'm a horse, I can handle anything. He would tell people that. I'm a horse, bring it on. He said that night. I'm a horse, I can handle it. Boom, just bring it on. Killed him. Bad decision. Yes?
I always think it's good to go to college, but perhaps when you're going into the NBA started thinking after that it's probably better to get people as soon as possible.
I don't know if that was the main reason they did. It was more of an academic concern about why the NCAA fought that for years, letting players leave early. But interestingly enough, the NBA had started 3 or 4 years prior, or a few years prior, teams were hiring security personnel to do research on the players they were going to draft. And the Celtics general manager told me for the book that they had research bias. They found nothing to be concerned about. And he told me that even if they knew he was using drugs, they were still going to draft him because of the upside, and they had never heard he was using it to an extent that Len was using it. Again, there were no indications he was addicted, but some people told me he was using it up to twice a week. That person was, and I have a section in the book which really says a lot about his. I mean, there's nothing more impactful than blood legacy. 2 weeks after Len died, a baby was born, and it turns out to be Len Bias's only son, who later on he's now 27. He had drug problems. I talked to him in jail. He's been incarcerated. He blames his condition on not having a father and wondering who Len Bias was. Now, he could come up with reasons for what he was doing. But he grew up in public housing, had a very, very difficult life, and he's 27 years old. So the NBA was already sort of looking into that and trying to be careful with that, but it still was happening. Yes, sir.
At what point after his death did you decide to write the book, and were there other triggers, influences why you decided to write the book?
I didn't decide to write the book until 2009. Some of you may be familiar with a documentary called Without Bias, which does a very good job of creating the story about Len's life, his career at Maryland, and how he died in the immediate aftermath, which up to a year after he died, and then there was a trial for Brian Tribble. He was acquitted of the charges. He was the only one brought up on charges. I saw the documentaries 2009. I'd written 3 previous books, 2 previous ones about athletics at Maryland. As I mentioned before, I covered him as a journalist. I knew people who were impacted by his death personally within the department. I saw what it did to them. It caused them personal problems, professional problems. Athletic administrators couldn't get jobs for a while because they were involved with that story. And I researched, after I saw the documentary, I noticed that no books had been written about him since the early 1990s. There were 2 books. One by a Baltimore journalist, I'm forgetting his name, who I think has since passed away, Brent Frazier, I forget his last name. And I know why. I learned quickly why. Still people don't want to talk about it. It was we talk about H.L. Mencken being a great journalist. The journalistic part about this, the biggest challenge was, how am I going to get people to talk? A lot of people still did not want to talk. You really have to work hard to get their trust. A lot of them were former Maryland athletes. I thought myself being a Maryland athlete would help, and to some extent it did. I knew some of the people who were involved with it when they were at Maryland. After I had left, I still knew people. That helped. So those were contributing factors in wanting me to write the book. And I knew the story, and I just didn't know it was going to be that hard to write. Sure. Okay, thank you very much.